Hi, welcome to Chapter 3, Part 2. So we're going to continue talking about epithelial tissue, starting from number 1 in bold in your outline on the first page, simple squamous. So we're going to move through each kind of epithelial tissue. Keep in mind that you're going to want to know for the exam what the tissue looks like in histology slide. You're going to need to know the function of the tissue and also where you would find it in the body. So let's start with simple squamous. Simple squamous is a one layer of flat cells. So this kind of tissue is very thin and very delicate. And so it's not going to be very protective. It's actually going to be in places in your body that are going to either be areas of diffusion where substances can pass through readily, such as your capillaries, which are the smallest microscopic blood vessels in the body, or in your lungs where you exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. That's a simple squamous tissue. You can also see, so I do have, for example, in your outline, alveoli of the lungs, which are air sacs of the lungs, and the capillaries. So the job and the function of this tissue is diffusion, secretion, absorption, and reduces friction. So let's look at this picture here for reducing friction, because it does create the serous membranes of your body. So if you remember from chapter 1, we talked about serous membranes. They are your peritoneal cavity where all your abdominal organs are. It is your lungs and your heart. So remember that there's a membrane, that parietal peritoneum or visceral peritoneum, where it secretes that serous fluid. So that reduces the friction of your organs. So that membrane, that serous membrane, is made out of this kind of tissue. It's simple squamous tissue. So it does help reduce friction in those areas, right? I talked about the permeability and absorption and secretion. So let's talk about where you would, or how it looks. So this is the cartoon, right? The diagram of it. So we see that it looks like a lot of fried eggs right next to each other. The actual histology slide is what you're going to be able to, you need to be able to recognize on the exam. So when you see a tissue that looks like this, it's going to be simple squamous. It's kind of like looking down on a tiled floor. Now, here's the trick. Some students ask, well, how do I know that the tiled floor is just one layer? And how do I know there's not more layers underneath? The trick is, in a light microscope, you could not see the tissue if there's 2 or more layers. So you can only see the tissue because light needs to shine through those cells, and you can only see that one layer. So when you see something that looks like this, you can say it's simple squamous with confidence. You also want to be able to label on the exam these structures. You want to be able to label the cytoplasm. So if I point to the center of the cell as so, you would say that's a cytoplasm. You would have to identify the nucleus, and I would also expect you to identify the cell membrane. So if I point to, the line between the cells, such as right here or right here, right, that's the cell membrane. All right, so that is it for simple squamous epithelium. So I do have an area for you to sketch it. It says to include the basal lamina. So the basal lamina in this kind of view, where you are looking down onto the tiled floor, is very difficult because it'd be underneath the tile. But let's say we have a side view. So let's look at this picture, right? So let's look at this, the gland first. Notice that we have this empty space, right? We said that the spaces were called the lumen. So this is a lumen of a gland. There's no need to know that it is a gland, but you have to identify the free open space because you know that the epithelial cells will line that space. So now let's look at where our epithelial cells are. We can see the nucleus. We can see it show up as a purple object. And how many nuclei do I see wrapping around? So I see 1 here, I see 2 here, and I see a third one there. The rest of this is the extension. So notice how from this nucleus, we have this really thin, darker staining purple. That is the cytoplasm of the cell. So how thin, it's very remarkable how thin it is. So where would the basal lamina or the basement membrane be? It would be underneath that cell layer. So it would be here, right? Underneath that cell would be anchored to the tissue below it. So I will tell you that it is invisible in this image. Sometimes the basal lamina is not visible, but you do need to know that it's there. It's always present whether you can see it or not. And then all of this other tissue in the background is going to be connective tissue. So you see how we have collagen fibers. Collagen fibers, you'll learn to recognize those as they always stain this very light pink. And remember how they looked in that SEM image we saw earlier as kind of like ropes? Well, they're going to look like bands sometimes in these slides. This is that top-down view of simple squamous tissue. So this should look familiar now because it looks very much like our first one here. Again, recognize the nucleus, recognize the cytoplasm, recognize the cell membrane. Also know the function, reducing friction, diffusion, absorption, secretion, and where you find in the body. A couple places I mentioned would be the capillaries and lungs, the alveoli of the lungs. There is a nice list for you here if you want to like read through it and see where else you find it. But the alveoli of the lungs are here. Blood vessels are here. You could also say that you find it in your serous membranes, right? Because that's what this picture is basically showing you, is those serous membranes. All right, let's move on to number 2. So the second epithelial tissue is simple cuboidal. If you notice, I listed simple cuboidal and simple columnar together because they have the same basic function, and that's secretion and absorption. Now, these cells are found, the way that you tell the difference between them, again, I mentioned this earlier, is that cuboidal cells are little squares with a nice, perfectly round, big nucleus. And then columnar cells are oblong nucleus with a taller cell. Here, of course, we're looking at simple cuboidal. So let's move through where you would find cuboidal cells. The best word to memorize and associate with cuboidal cells is glands. Any gland you can think of in the body, you have cuboidal cells. You have some parts of the kidney that are also cuboidal, but glands is good. And if you think about what glands do, glands secrete substances. Hormones are secreted from your hormonal glands, right? Your saliva, your salivary glands are secreting saliva. So glands, sweat glands, for example, are going to secrete sweat. So it's a very big secretion, tissue. Look at how it looks, right? So this is a tube that is lined with simple cuboidal epithelium. This is what you want to recognize in a histology image in your exam. It'll be the real deal. So this is really nice because it shows you this longitudinal cut. Here's the lumen, right? That's the empty space. We know we're going to have epithelial cells lining that empty space. We can see the general structure of these cube-shaped cells. And that basal lamina, even though it's not, it is kind of showing up. It is showing up if you look at this top. You can see the hot pink line that runs underneath it. I'm going to trace on top of it right now, right? So it's that hot pink line, that's the basal lamina. And then under that, what do we have? Connective tissue. Okay, so again, always epithelial, then basal lamina underneath that, then connective tissue underneath that. All right, so where you find in the body, again, glands, secretion, absorption, and now you know what it looks like. Let's move on to simple columnar. So now you see how the nuclei look very different, right? They're oval shaped, and the cells are very tall, long cells like a column. These cells are very, very common in your digestive tract. So if you want to memorize digestive tract, the intestine is a great place to say where you find simple columnar cells. The stomach is also part of the digestive tract. You have other places too, but what I want to really impress on you is that and something easy to memorize is that the digestive tract is all about absorption, right? So this is a great place to think about absorbing nutrients and having these columnar cells present. Now, we talked about microvilli already to increase the surface area for absorption. So one very common thing that you see on both columnar cells and cuboidal cells, because they do function to secrete and absorb, is this increased surface area structure. So a lot of them will have microvilli. Microvilli, you do need to recognize this for your exam, will show up at the apical surface of the cell, and it will look like a tiny little edge, a different kind of border on the top of the cell. You won't be able to see the individual microvilli as you see in this sort of drawing of the tissue. It'll look more like the right-hand side image. So the sort of nickname given to this microvilli is brush border, because it looks like a hairbrush and the bristles of the hairbrush. All right, so I think we went over everything there. Again, basal lamina, right? We can see the basal lamina on the right-hand side as this light pink line traveling underneath the cells, okay? And then we have connective tissue underneath that. All right, so let's take a look at the difference between cilia and microvilli on a histology slide. Because they're both these hair-like extensions on the apical surface of a cell, sometimes they look, sometimes students have a hard time differentiating between the two, and it does take a lot of practice to recognize the difference. Cilia are much longer, and in a histology slide, it's easier to see individual cilia. But microvilli tend to be very short, okay? And you don't tend to see the individual microvilli. This image actually is a very good image. This is something that you probably won't see a lot, because you can actually do see the individual microvilli. But notice how just the length of these guys are different. Okay, and again, the function of them are very different too. Remember, cilia is to sweep substances across the cell, and microvilli are to increase the surface area. So different functions, they look different on histology slides, and they're going to be found in different areas. Okay, again, microvilli will be found in your digestive tract, digestive system, because you want to increase the surface area for absorption. And I'm being a little vague here. Let's go with intestine, because that's better. That's a better answer. Your intestines have microvilli, so it'll be simple columnar cells with microvilli. So coming back to this image, if you get this image on an exam and I ask you, what's this structure? Your answer is microvilli. All right. Moving on to our next kind of tissue. This is called pseudostratified columnar. Now, it's actually pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So it's a 4-word name to this tissue. We haven't talked about pseudostratified yet. All I told you at this point is simple and stratified. Pseudostratified. So let's think about what this prefix means. Pseudo means fake, right? So this is a fake stratified tissue, which means that it looks stratified. Take a look at the diagram here. It looks like there's many layers of cells because I have my nuclei at different levels of this tissue. However, every single cell runs down and it connects to the basal lamina. So it indeed is a simple layer, but it looks stratified. That's why it's called pseudostratified. It has cilia, so we want to put that into the name, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, because the cells are long and column-shaped. They're kind of crowded and smushed in this diagram here. It's hard to see. They're column-shaped, but they are taller than they are wide. So they're not going to be cuboidal. They're not flat, so your only other choice is columnar. Okay, let's take a look at the functions. Protection, because the cells are very tall And also, because the cells are tall, it protects the connective tissue underneath. But also the cilia, right? We talked about how the cilia sweeps mucus across the surface of the cells and it protects your body from the debris. So that is a protective mechanism, and that's why protection is there. So let's look at the where you find it in the body. So the only place you find this in the body in large amounts is the respiratory system. So if you take a look at the locations, the nasal cavity, the trachea is your windpipe. The bronchi are the larger tubes of the lungs. So all those first three regions are the respiratory tract. And then you have very small portions of the male reproductive tract. So if you just want to memorize one word associated with the with pseudostratified ciliated columnar, respiratory, but pick a big tube, some big trachea, for example, is a good word to use because it's your windpipe, right? It's where the air starts to enter into your lungs, before it goes into your lungs. All right, so let's take a look at how it appears, right? Can we tell, or can you look at this picture and tell where the epithelial layer ends and the connective tissue begins? Hopefully you can. So notice that bottom layer of cells, the basal layer of cells, is going to, well, it's not basal layer because it's not stratified, but those nuclei at the bottom are kind of organized. So then here is where we find the end of our epithelial tissue. This is the beginning of our connective tissue. Okay. Here's another look at the pseudostratified ciliated columnar. So if you see this image on your exam, you should be able to say, this is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And if I ask you where you find it in the body, you can say trachea. If I ask you, what are these structures? Those are cilia, right? And all the rest pertain to, like, what is this? This is a nucleus, right? And can you see the basal lamina? This picture, it's very clear. So there's this nice line. I'm going to start to draw on top of it, right? There's this line that goes across underneath our epithelial layer, anchoring it to the connective tissue underneath. So that is our basal lamina. And here is our connective tissue. Okay, so what's the function of this tissue? Protection and secretion. I should say the secretion is the mucus that's involved in the your respiratory tract produces mucus, and so it secretes mucus. All right, let's move on to our stratified tissues now. So this is stratified squamous. Stratified squamous is protective. So when you have a stratified tissue, especially stratified squamous, it does, the many layers does protect the connective tissue underneath. So this, right, is all the epithelial layer. In this image, the histology slide, that is your epithelial layer. Here is your connective tissue. The basal lamina is not very clear here. So, but you can sort of see where the epithelial layer stops and the connective tissue starts. Now, the function is protection for this kind of tissue. Look how many layers of cells we have. We have, more than 10 maybe layers of cells. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 10. But this is going to line the parts of your body that are going to be physically physically abrased, right? So physical abrasion. So think about rubbing or foreign objects coming in. So the mouth is a good example of this, and the tongue is a good example of this, because you're going to put in food, and your cheeks as well, right? So your food will scrape against the lining of your cheeks, and so all of those top layer of cells, those can come off, and they actually do come off every day. They're lost, but you have the other tissues, the other cells, to protect your connective tissue of the mouth. You swallow the food, your esophagus is also going to be lined with the same kind of tissue, because your esophagus is also going to get a physical rubbing from the food, right? So throat, esophagus, oral cavity, that's mouth, also places rectum, the anus, and the vagina. So again, so physical protection. Another nice function is it protects against pathogens. Those are germs, and chemical attack. So anything that's nasty chemical on the outside of your body. Again, because you just have this top layer that can get sort of destroyed with the chemical, or but it protects the bottom, the underneath layers. I want you to see the difference between keratinized and non-keratinized stratified squamous. So if you look at under letter number 4, there's letter A and B. Keratinized stratified squamous is only your skin. It is the epidermis of your skin. And so this is the only place you're going to find keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Take a look at the picture underneath the word keratinized. Can you see the difference between the epidermis and the dermis? Or another way of phrasing that is, can you see the difference between the epithelial layer and the connective tissue? So hopefully it's very apparent. Epithelial cells, I'm going to draw the line that's going to border between the epithelial layer and the connective tissue, right? So now we can see connective tissue, you want to remember this, is always going to stain lighter than the epithelial tissue. And this because what picks up stain is the nucleus. And epithelial cells is one cell next to another one, next to another one, next to another. So there's lots of nuclei present. So it'll overall pick up a lot of stain. Connective tissue is different. You can kind of see how connective tissue, there's one nucleus here, there's another one here, they're spread apart, right? So because they're spread apart, connective tissue tends to stain a lot lighter. Very light, okay? So you can kind of see the difference between the epidermis and dermis, or that epithelial layer and the connective tissue underneath, which is the dermis. The dermis is actually connective tissue. All right, so what does it mean to be keratinized? The keratinized layer is all filled with a tough, waterproof protein called keratin. So keratin is a protein. You can kind of see this bracket where I'm drawing here. This upper part of your skin is all dead cells. They are called keratinized cells because they're filled with keratin before they die. And they're basically sheets of keratin. So keratinized means that you have a dead upper layer filled with keratin. This is, again, only in the skin. Everywhere else in your body, so here, everywhere else in your body, besides your skin, your oral cavity, your throat, your esophagus, rectum, anus, vagina, those are going to be non-keratinized. So those are your mucous membranes. Again, can you see the difference between the epithelial layer and the connective tissue layer? This image is mostly epithelial, right? But here's that division. That's where you find the basal lamina or the basement membrane, right? Here's the connective tissue underneath. Look how many layers of cells we have. That's a lot of cells, right? So very protective. Let me just review with you for a second that when you do lose some of these cells from the top, right, these cells will end up going away. They're rubbed off, they die and they fall off. The new cells are made at the bottom, right? The very bottom of the most basal layer of your epithelial cell, if it's stratified, those are where your stem cells are. Those are your regenerative cells, and those will divide and then push all the older cells up. All right, so that's the difference between the two. Let's look at our next tissue type, which is stratified cuboidal. So we have a stratified, more than one layer of cuboidal cells. You find this in larger glands, so the lining of some ducts of the glands. This is example of a sweat gland duct. And we're looking at the lumen is the empty space, right? The lumen is this empty space in the middle of a tube. Remember, we're talking about a duct, like a hollow tube. And then we have our lining of multiple square cells. Where would our basal lamina be, right? So our basal lamina is going to adhere that bottom layer, the bottom layer of the cells, because this is, the lumen is here, that's the top. So this is the top layer of your epithelial cells. Then you go down to the bottom, and then this is where your basal lamina would be. The basal lamina is going to connect those cells to the connective tissue surrounding it. Okay? Again, identify the nucleus, and you want to take a look at how it appears in the actual histology slide. So this is a good example how I can't see in this picture, I can't see the cytoplasm. All I see is a bunch of nuclei in a circle, right? So you need to be able to recognize, oh, those nuclei are round, those are cuboidal cells. If the nuclei were ovals, then that would be columnar cells, but that's not happening. So the function of stratified cuboidal is absorption, secretion, just like our simple cuboidal, and there's some protection here because, again, it's stratified. Here's another look at stratified cuboidal. So I know this is a very confusing image, but let's find the lumen, right? The lumen is where the X is. Here's another lumen. So I have the edge or the border of my space. That's the top of my epithelial cells. Where's the bottom? There it is. I can kind of make out right there is, generally speaking, and that's my red mark here is where you would find the basal lamina, and then the connective tissue is everywhere around it. Okay, I might have been a little bit wide there, maybe like that. Okay, let's look at stratified columnar. So stratified columnar tissue, look at the diagram first. Notice how the basal layer or the bottom layer is going to be cuboidal, but remember you name the tissue by the apical layer, the top layer of cells. So the superficial columnar cells make this stratified columnar. And this is a longitudinal look, right? Because the lumen is this long space. This is the top layer of your cells. The bottom layer is going to be attached to the connective tissue by the basal lamina. So notice the basal lamina is a little bit hard to see, but again, you need to just know it's there. All right. These will be found in more glands, okay, salivary glands, mammary gland, so bigger glands, and the function is protection. Here's a look at stratified columnar. Okay. So we know, so let's go ahead and figure out, this is the empty space, right? This is the space. So this is my top layer. So this edge is the apical layer, and my bottom layer is here, right? And that's, I'm drawing that line, that's where my basal lamina, and then this is connective tissue. All right, our last epithelial tissue to talk about is transitional. So this is the only one that's named after its function and not the way it looks. So let's talk about the word transitional. Transitional means that it goes between a stretched and relaxed version of itself. So it's found in organs that can stretch. So the bladder is a really great thing to memorize. The renal pelvis is inside of your kidney. That's kind of a technical term at this point. You might also know ureters. Those are the tubes that bring the urine from your kidneys to your bladder. But I think everybody, bladder is a great thing to memorize and associate with transitional, because when your bladder is empty, it's relaxed and it's a smaller space on the inside. Then it fills up with urine and it stretches. And so the tissue stretches with it. So look at the relaxed version. The relaxed version is stratified cells, but at the top we have these dome-shaped umbrella cells, and that's what gives it away. So these are, your book, these are called umbrella cells, right? Or dome-shaped cells. And then when they get stretched, you notice that it flattens out. So it's kind of like a pleated skirt where you have extra tissue and then you pull it taut and it goes away, right? you might be asking yourself, well, different organs are also stretchy. Like, so your stomach, right? It's small when it's empty, and after a big meal, it stretches. Why isn't the stomach lined also with transitional epithelium? And it's because the stomach has a job that trumps stretching. So the job of the stomach is to digest your food, so it has to secrete a lot of gastric juice. So the lining is going to be predominantly a secretive or secreting those digestive enzymes. So that function is going to be more for the simple columnar. But the bladder doesn't have any other job other than holding urine and stretching to hold the urine. So that's why the bladder has transitional and not the stomach. Okay, so I know that this image right here, if you look at this bottom image, it looks like stratified squamous tissue. So if I'm going to give you transitional tissue, I will give you the relaxed version. So your job is to look for these really dome-shaped cells on the surface, and that's going to be the hallmark of transitional. Okay. So here's a couple of images. So this is a relaxed bladder, and you can see these dome-shaped cells right here, right? So they have a curve to them. And then your stretched version where you don't have that, everything's flattened out. All right, so this is a quick mini quiz. Identify the epithelium, give one function of the tissue, and give an area of the body of the tissue. So go ahead and pause and jot down the answer. So this epithelium is simple columnar. Simple columnar. Where is my lumen? Here, here, here. There's many lumen here. And so after my lumen, I see that I have one layer of cells, and these cells have a nice round nucleus, okay? And that's my simple cuboidal. And then my basal lamina or basement membrane will be here, and then here is some connective tissue, okay? What's one function of simple cuboidal? You can say secretion, you can say absorption. Give an area of the body with this tissue, a duct, okay, or a gland. All right, excellent. Here's another kind of tissue. Identify the epithelium. Where do you find this tissue in the body, and what is the cell at the arrow? We haven't gotten there yet, so let's first two. The epithelium is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Where do you find this tissue in the body? The trachea, the bronchi, or the back of the throat, or the nasal cavity. Okay, so here's our cilia. Here is our pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And this is where the epithelium stops and the connective tissue picks up. Okay, this cell, I haven't talked about this yet, but this is called a goblet cell. It's coming up in just a second. Notice how it's a nice kind of round cell. It's clear inside. It's filled with mucus, and it will secrete mucus up to the surface of your respiratory tract. Here's another one. These cells will go all the way down to the bottom because this is pseudostratified, but the top of these cells are filled with mucus, and they secrete the mucus on the top. All right, so that's the kinds of tissues. Let's look at letter E and letter F. These glands and membranes are also epithelial cells. Oops, sorry about that, flipping. The three kinds of exocrine glands. Notice in your outline how we have number 1, endocrine glands, and number 2, exocrine glands. So glands are specialized epithelial cells that make something and secrete something, right? So there are two kinds of ways to secrete their substances. Endocrine glands secrete their substances directly into the bloodstream. So there's no empty space or duct to carry the stuff out into a space. It just seeps out of the cells, it migrates to a blood vessel, and there it goes into your bloodstream. hormones are secreted this way. So your whole endocrine system, right, which deals with hormones, all the endocrine glands of your body secrete their hormones this way. So endocrine glands secrete hormone. What are the other glands of your body that don't make hormone, right? Those are called exocrine glands. Exocrine glands are going to secrete their substances and either pump them into a cavity or a duct or outside your body, okay? So think about those glands. These are sweat glands. These are oil glands. These are mammary glands, salivary glands, your digestive organ glands. If they're going to secrete substances into the lumen of your stomach, for example, that's a space. The salivary glands secrete it into your mouth, right? That's a space. Your sweat glands secrete it outside your body. So those are two different kinds of glands. And how do exocrine glands secrete their substances? Turns out there's 3 different kinds of exocrine glands: miracrine, holocrine, and apocrine. So let's look at letter A, miracrine. Miracrine glands, what's going on in these cells here? So we see, if you look carefully, the red substances, these red dots inside the cell, they are the substance. They are getting packaged up in a vesicle, and the vesicles are moving up to the surface and being released, right? So you see that. So this is exocytosis, and this is the way that miracrine glands secrete their substances. So the gland itself, these cells, nothing happens to the cells. They're fine. They just secrete their substances. That's not true for the next 2. So let's look at holocrine, which is letter B in your outline. Holocrine glands, the whole cell is lost. So let's take a look at what's going on in the picture. Notice that the nucleus is in purple. Well, I'm coloring it in red, right? But this cell is completely lost. So the substances are made inside the cell, they stay inside the cell, and then the cell itself is lost in the gland. The cell eventually disintegrates and releases the contents. And so the contents are released outside, but the cell is lost as well. So I like to think of holocrine as the whole cell, right? The whole cell. So it has the same sound, holocrine, whole. Apocrine glands is the top surface of the cell, the apical surface of the cell, breaks off and is lost. So you don't lose the whole cell, but you do lose the top portion of the cell. So the substance is inside and you lose that. So those are the 3 ways that your glands secrete their substances. Now, our special goblet cell that we mentioned earlier. A goblet cell is a unicellular exocrine gland. It's only one cell. It's considered a gland itself, and it secretes mucus, okay? It secretes mucus. Now, the protein that mucus is made from is called mucin, okay? And so mucin is inside the cell, and then when it's secreted outside, it's called mucus, okay? So these cells are really fun to see because they're really obvious. Let's take a look at this image here. Notice that we have this really white round cell. That's a goblet cell. Here's another one. Here's another one. Here's another one. Here's another one. This is littered, right? There's 3 in a row here. Another little small one. Tons and tons of goblet cells. So this image is actually taken from your intestines, and your intestines make a lot of mucus. And this is just a nice blow up of that goblet cell. Okay, so you need to recognize a goblet cell in a histology slide, and they show up, as you can see, as a shimmery white sort of bowl or round structure because the mucus is clear, right? All of this area is mucus, it's clear, and or I say mucin, and then it gets secreted out. All right, our last topic for glands is their shape. So glands come in different shapes. You will learn a couple of different terms. The first term is just what shape it has, alveolar or tubular. Tubular just means that the gland itself is like an oblong tube. You can see that here. Alveolar is where it's more round and bag-like. Okay, so those are the two basic shapes that glands can have. Glands can be big or small, and simple glands tend to be small. Compound glands tend to be big, and a compound gland has more than one duct. So the simple glands here, if you look at the purple versus the pink, what is the difference between the two? Why is some of these cells purple? Why are some pink? The purple cells don't make anything. They are the tissue on top, or they serve as a duct. So let me explain. A duct is just a passageway. It's like a hallway. The pink area is actually busy making sweat. Let's say this is sweat, right? So it's busy making sweat. So all the sweat is made in the pink cells. And here's the sweat building up, building up, building up. And then it gets shuttled out through the duct. So the duct doesn't make sweat. It just allows the sweat to come out of the body. Okay. So simple glands will just have one duct. The duct is at the very top. But compound glands have inner ducts. So if you look at the pictures here, we have our duct here, but we also have a second duct here. In our second picture, we have a duct at the top. We also have a second duct area here. Our third picture, 1, 2, 3 areas of duct. So if you have more than one duct, it's called compound, which tends to be bigger glands. If you only have one duct, it's a simple gland, and it's only one duct. And some glands have both tubes and alveolar areas. So tubulo-alveolar. If you take a look at this gland, these areas are tubular, right? Because they look like tubes. And then this is alveolar. They're circular. So this gland has both, so we combine the words into tubulo-alveolar. All right, our last topic is membranes for epithelial cells. So the membranes of your body are made of epithelium. Membranes, all the characteristics of membranes is the same as epithelium, right? So your membranes are avascular. Your membranes are regenerative. Your membranes are innervated. So all that stuff is true. Now let's take a look at our membranes. Mucous membrane, okay? The mucous membrane is found in all of the areas of your body that are exposed to the outside but not covered by skin. Mucous membrane is called such because it's coated with mucus. So think about the parts of your body that are maybe exposed to the outside world, but it's not skin. So you're going to begin with maybe your mouth, right? Anything from the outside, you can put that in your mouth, food, for example, and that's from the outside world, but it's not skin. So it turns out that your entire digestive tract is mucous membrane. The digestive tract is mucous membrane because so if you put a piece of food in your mouth, it can touch your mouth, your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, large intestine, and out your rectum and anus. So that's all lined with mucous membrane. The respiratory tract as well. So when you breathe in, your trachea, your bronchi, those larger tubes of the lungs, the throat, the back of your nose, or your nasal cavity, those are all mucous membrane as well. Portions of the urinary and reproductive tracts, right? So the openings to the outside world, the vagina, the urethra, those areas are also mucous membrane. So what does mucus help us do? The mucus is protective because it helps trap particles or germs and move them out of the body, okay? So it's a layer of protective mucus. It's a sticky substance. It, prevents germs from entering deeper into our body. It oozes, not very pleasant, but it oozes off of our body, or away from our body, because the mucus, it just does that, right? And it brings the germs with it. So your first line of defense is skin. Skin is the best. It's the toughest and most formidable barrier to germs and to chemicals. Second is your mucous membrane. All right, so let's talk about the number 2, our serous membranes. I'm not going to cover this. We covered that in chapter 1. Number 3, cutaneous membranes. I'm not really going to talk about this because this is skin. The chapter 4 talks about that. And then number 3, synovial membrane will go into detail in chapter 5, but for now, just know that it lines your joints. So your knee joint, your elbow joint, your hip joint, the freely moving joints of your body, they are lined with this synovial membrane, and the synovial membrane makes a fluid that lubricates the joints. So it's really good for mobility, because you don't want friction within the joints. Friction will cause tissue damage, and that's bad. So that is basically it for membranes. Okay, so we have the 4 different membranes that are created from epithelial tissue. All right, so we're going to stop and do connective tissue in the next part.